Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my GaudiMSBiz22.com uh, podcasts and YouTube videos, which you can see on here on Podbean and see on YouTube. I am very, very pleased today to be joined by a repeat customer, Dr. Michael Hanby, who is professor down at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. And of course, my sidekick, my friend, my buddy, Dr. Rodney Howsare, my former colleague at DeSales University. And I'm just going to say right up front to all my guests, we're saying, okay, well, what's the topic of the conversation? We don't know. we're not quite certain what we're going to talk about. I just was thinking last week or week and a half ago, I thought I want to have Hanby on again and Howsare and just have the three of us talk about whatever. And so it was more just my desire to have Mike Hanby back on the show than any sort of burning issue. But we did decide, and I think it's important. Dr. Tracy Roland, who Rodney and I interviewed a few weeks ago now, I think. Ratzinger Prize winner, leading theologian in Australia, wonderful, wonderful woman. And we interviewed her based on her Communio article in the last issue of Communio on Ratzinger and democracy in the church. She has also recently given the graduation commencement speech at Christendom College in Virginia of this year. And that speech was published in Catholic World Report, I think exclusively there. Maybe you can find it elsewhere, but I'll mention CWR because they publish my stuff. So I'm going to give them a plug. So I thought that it was a significant enough talk, and Mike and Rodney agree that we want to sort of lead off with that. So that's the semblance of a skeleton for our conversation tonight. And in that talk, Dr. Roland really sort of laid down a gauntlet to the graduates there. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you since you're the guest of honor, and say, what was your biggest takeaway from Tracy Roland's commencement speech at Christendom?
Oh, I'm not sure that there's just one. Oh, first of all, it's good to see you guys.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Welcome.
yeah.
I'm having a nice glass of gin, so there we
I'm
go.
having a nice glass of water. But thanks for having me back on. I figure that the topic of not having a topic was potentially dangerous enough, because who knows where it will lead. I might say something true, that I should stick to water. So that's what I'm going to do. But you know, I was really struck by the her talk, and I think my first overall reaction to it was, first of all, just this is lovely. If it's the season of commencement speeches. I think I read this the same week that the Harrison Butker speech at
Benedictine.
Benedictine came out, and it made for quite the contrast. Obviously, and my first thought was just that it was lovely, but also that it was quite uh, profound and comprehensive in its scope. And what I think was so compelling about it is that she was able to place uh, the graduates, as it were, as they're about to go out into the world, in the context of a much richer and deeper and broader and more comprehensive reading of the signs of the times than we typically see. And it was a reading that was not defined uh, so much by the contemporary exigencies of American politics, or even for that matter, the contemporary exigencies of all the little crises that are flourishing in the church. But it gave a reading of kind of the tragedy of the modern world, the comprehensive loss of faith in God, the secularization of our vision, the secularization of the church, that really charged the students or the graduates with a task to keep the faith. And it also paid lovely tribute to much maligned a much maligned group, which is namely just ordinary Catholics who say their rosaries and go to mass and believe what they've been taught, and who, in living their lives stubbornly that way, right, who aren't particularly necessarily political or engaged in the church polemics, but who in just living the faith have sustained institutions like that, who've produced a small cohort of remarkable young people on whom it's going to fall to remain sane in an insane world. And it seems to me that in the context of painting that picture, all of the various crises that we're experiencing in the church just sort of fell into place in a nice, sanguine kind of way. And partly what I appreciated about it is it had a kind of stabilitas to it. I mean, there's something about looking at problems in view of eternity or of the long game that makes that kind of sort of defuses one's anxiety over over present issues. I mean, you come away with the sense that what endures. I came away, and I'm reading into and out of the talk as much as I'm repeating what she said. One of your listeners,
that's fine. No,
one of your listeners could go and reread the speech. Where did it appear? Was
Catholic World Report.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could go and reread the speech and say, well, what's Hanby talking about? I don't see this here. I mean, this is me sort of meditating on what was so beautiful about it. But it's reassuring to think, when you're when one looks at the present divided state of the church and the uncertain state of the future, or the almost certain state of the almost certain expectation that the future of the church is going to be more division, more confrontation, more compromise, more mediocrity. You and Cale Zeldin have talked about demoralization, I think. Is it you and Cale that have talked about that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciated that. And it's pretty easy, I think, to get demoralized. And part of what one takes from a speech like Tracy's, the reassuring thing is that what endures, the only things that really endure are those that transcend. Right? Fashions can do can cause their mischief and do their damage. And that can extend for quite a long time, but they don't last. What endures is what's true, and what's good and what's beautiful. And there's something about Tracy's speech that was just reassuring in that way. Is that too an abstract of a
no, not at all. One of the things that strikes me anytime I've been around Tracy, and she is a friend, and I've met her many times.
Yeah, me too.
And we interviewed her a few weeks ago. One of the this is a very subjective impression that I have, but whenever Tracy walks into a room, you have this overwhelming feeling of, at last, an adult has arrived.
Well, that's because she usually walks into a room that has like you and me and Rodney.
That's right. That's right.
That's the
impression that you get, and I hate to engage in stereotypes because she's a woman, but it's like the school marm has come in to a bunch of unruly kids and said, let's have some sanity now, shall we? And that's it. You use the word sane, and that's what Tracy is. She brings such common sense, such down-to-earth sanity combined with deep erudition that is just this magnificent breath of fresh air. So I agree with you that the talk was very uplifting. Rodney, what did you think?
Yeah, no, the same. I mean, it's this is not a talk that you would expect a 21st century PhD in theology, to give, right? It's very prophetic, yeah. Has a kind of an almost apocalyptic sort of feel to it. And as Michael said, the refreshing thing about it is the entire situation that we're in is being judged in the light of something that doesn't change, something that's not in the throes, so to speak. And then the kind of, shout outs throughout the talk to these figures who throughout time tapped into that in order to help their times, which are also troubled and Alcuin, et cetera, right? Yeah, because it's that we all get sucked into this tendency in the modern world because everything has become so politicized, sociologized, historicized, et cetera, to kind of figure out, try to get our bearings within the muck. Where do I stand in the midst of all of these things? And this just refreshing thing, like just coming at it from an entirely different angle and calling people up. That was what was bracing to me.
Yes, I was struck too. I think that's well said, Rodney, and the almost apocalyptic in the sense that there was this strong military motif that ran through her talk, where she wants to emphasize that, like a good Balthasarian, that we're all caught up in a theodramatic struggle with eternal significance. And I once again reading into the talk, and sort of riffing on it. One of my complaints about the modern world is it presents us with a crisis, yes, but it's a crisis in the form of an anti-crisis, in the sense that it wants to convince us all that there's no such thing as a moral or spiritual ernstfall, a moral or spiritual crisis, that these are illusions, and that these are spiritual little rabbit holes that you don't want to go down for the sake of your mental health. And so what Tracy reminds us in this talk, no, we are caught up in a theodramatic struggle. And it is a form of spiritual warfare. And we are fighting against principalities and powers. And you had better steel yourself to the moment, graduates, because the day has long since passed when you can sort of coast in neutral. Because not to choose one way or the other, Christ or nothing, is to choose. And that is my strongest takeaway, because it's one of my hobby horses that I write about so much. And so, yeah, this was a real call to arms, which is, the other thing that's great is that she understands youth. Youth is a time for idealism. Young people want to be called to arms, especially spiritual arms. And that's what she did here.
The other thing that I think was so moving and reassuring about it, I mean, we cannot be reminded often enough, and we are reminded very frequently, that in spite of the overwhelmingly suffocating mediocrity, in spite of the unspeakable scandal and corruption and rot, in spite of the historical tragedies of the Christian encounter with civilizations throughout the world. And I often say, the church has a lot to be humble about. And I think that's really true. In spite of all of that, there is a greatness to Christianity and a grandeur to Christian civilization that is expressed. Oh, you're getting serious.
Oh, yeah.
A grandeur to Christian civilization, that's inscribed into the stones and into the music and into the art and into the liturgy and into the philosophy, a grandeur to which, our children should be heirs. Right. But our whole orientation to history now is one of overcoming and surpassing. And so we've really broken that kind of we've broken the kind of generational transmission that is tradition, that is the act of handing on a culture and its understanding of the meaning of things. What I found so lovely and reassuring also about her talk, and I agree with you. Everything you said about Tracy, I agree with, and I would add to it that she's also very courageous and strong. She's very strong. Yes. That it allows us to glimpse that easily. It allows us to glimpse a bit of that grandeur and to remember it. It's so easy to forget. It's so easy to forget, mired down in 20th, first century Catholic mediocrity. That the coming of Christ and his setting in motion the church is the most important thing to have happened in the history of the world.
Yeah.
And it is the most important thing to have happened in the history of the world, and the importance of that ripples out from that sort of the ground zero of the crucifixion into a whole form of civilization that we've been taught to be ashamed of.
Yeah.
And and I don't think we can be ashamed of it and continue anything like a Christianity that well, that is Christian. That is to say, that is ultimately in any way really continuous with what we've been given.
Yeah.
Wow, that's powerful. We've been told to be ashamed of it. I couldn't agree more. I'm older than both of you, young coots, but not by much. But I have that's the distinct impression that I had as a young man coming of age in the 60s and the 70s vis-a-vis, Catholicism. The overall overarching impression that was given to me was shame.
Yeah.
Not about my naughty bits. That was shame that we should be ashamed as Catholics for being Catholics, essentially.
Right, right. And I think we have to be careful in saying that. I don't know if you saw, being up there in Pennsylvania, the front page story in today's Washington Post, and I don't know how much weight to put on it or how verified it is, but was about Indian, what do they call them? Residential schools for Indian children from the 19th to the 20th century in the United States, and what an enormous injustice and tragedy and travesty that was, and how much abuse was involved, of course. And of course, a lot of these were run by the church, and so the headline had something to do with Catholics operated schools, at which that has to be reckoned with.
Yeah.
Right. And to say that there's a grandeur here, and that being Catholic is not, and having a Catholic past is not something to be ashamed of, is not to be triumphalistic. I mean, we have to reckon with history, and we have to reckon with remote history. We have to reckon with more recent history, and to try and do so honestly, I think. But that doesn't negate the fact. I mean, if it did, I mean, there would be lots of reasons. That being only one of them. Lots of reasons for sort of giving up the ghost on Catholicism. I mean, we're offered new reasons every day to sort of throw in the towel on this thing. If ultimately, the fundamental reality and importance of it didn't outweigh everything else, right? If there were any place else to go, but there isn't. And so we have to reckon with both sides of that, and we don't reckon with the greatness side often enough because we're ashamed of the other parts.
Yeah, and it's more than a chastening. It's not like, okay, well, we're going to retrieve the tradition, but this time we'll do it, with a chastened understanding of our past sins. No, the past sins means, and I think Tracy was kind of hinting at this too, and talking about the principalities and powers that we struggle against. The past sins of the church means that in our retrieval of the tradition, which we're not going to be ashamed about, its glories, it has to be retrieved in an utterly new way. And the way that it's got to be retrieved is simply through a Christological reduction, especially, in my opinion, a cruciform reduction, that everything in the tradition is going to be sifted through the kenotic elements of Christ's crucifixion, the Paschal mystery, and so on. And whatever doesn't meet that standard is out, which leaves out all kinds of triumphalism. Now, I know that's very vague, and it's something I've been working on for years, but I believe that passionately. Rodney, do you want to interject something here? You're patiently sitting over there, wisely listening. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that this is something that we kind of touched on in our last podcast on Lumen Gentium, that sort of begins with the mystery of the church, the Marian, dimension, but doesn't in any way, shape, or form shy away from the fact that the pilgrim church is made up of sinners and et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to me that to try to solve the flaws of the past through merely sort of, again, sociological categories as if say let's say all the faults of the past are because the church was too patriarchal or something like that. So now we can fix it by making it more democratic or more accountable or all these things. It seems to me that the church fails precisely when it fails to realize that it is fundamentally a mystery that is given from above by God, that it's precisely not something that we can get together in committees and say, oh, what do we need to do to fix these problems in the church? You know, that's already the problem, right? It's always the church behaving as a merely human institution with people in power over other people, you know, et cetera, that causes all these problems to begin with. And every great reform, going right back to the reforms under Charlemagne, with all their warts and zits, were reforms that were directed towards something really, really lofty, a rediscovery of things that seemed almost like, well, how's that going to fix our problem? How's that going to fix the fact that our priests don't know how to read and write, But it was always some very sort of lofty vision. I get this from Chesterton. He's like, it's always the mystic who's the guy most suited to fix the problem, right? Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
No, I think
just about to say less politics, more mysticism.
Yes.
We're thinking along the same lines. Yeah. Sorry, Larry.
And I think that's kind of Tracy began, Dr. Roland, I guess we should say, but began her speech by, mentioning this is Christendom College I'm talking at. So let's talk a little bit about Christendom.
Right.
And what it boiled down to, though, is exactly what you were talking about, Rodney. For Tracy, Christendom wasn't constituted by this power structure and that power move. It was precisely constituted by that orientation of everything to that vertical dimension. The orientation of everything, like through everything congregating around the Benedictine monasteries and so forth, and their prayer life.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that again, that priority of the monastic, contemplative, truth, goodness, and beauty, as Michael said earlier, it's like these are the things that all the people that are trying to figure out how to fix our problem seem to never ever talk about these things. It's always, well, a little of this and a little of that, and
let's talk about that, because that's central to her talk as well. I mean, what she's pointing to, because she mentions the kind of deficit in sound Catholicism that we've all lived through over the past 50 or 60 years. And the fact of the matter is that there has been this, let's go back to Tracy's article in Communio then as well. This constant and incessant talk about structures and processes. We see it now in the synod and synodality and so forth. I know Tracy is resolutely opposed to this kind, not necessarily to synod on synodality, but to this kind of nonsense bureaucratization of the church, which is a kind of faux democratic imitation of democracy in the name of a kind of totalitarianism, actually.
Yeah, it's funny who the Democrats always turn out to be. It's always the same cast of characters, right? The same people writing the reports, the same people constituting the committees. I mean, it turns out there are only 1/10% or whatever, that infinitesimal number of synod participants that are Democrats in the church. But anyway, I'm sorry, I interject. Please carry on.
No, that was meant to act as a catalyst for further tying together her Communio article and her commencement speech. I think the two themes are deeply resonant there. What she's saying to the graduates at Christendom, you need to become mystics, and you need to delve into the mystery of the church, and you need to delve into the verticality that her sacramental life presents to you, to become members of the body of Christ, to rise to the challenge of the spiritual warfare, the theodramatic moment that is before you. Don't settle for mediocrity. And that the church of bureaucracy and committees is, and now she doesn't mention this in the commencement speech, but this is lurking in the background, is the church. It's the church of mediocrity. We have been in the church. I mean, Bishop Barron calls it beige Catholicism, whatever. That's become a kind of cliche now, but it's also true.
Yeah, it is true. And, it points to another thing that is operating as a subtext, I think, in Tracy's talk, it points to, I mean, it makes a really interesting contrast with some other more progressive interpretations of the signs of the times, shall we say. Because what it points to as a subtext is, I think, the deep crisis in the church, which is so deep that it's I think oftentimes not recognized by good-willed people who are in the grips of it, right? And that is the profound loss of faith. That, you know, to the point that we can't imagine. I mean, when you think about, and here I'm also thinking in the background of people like we bring them up all the time in these discussions. It seems like these podcasts are never complete without mentioning Blondel or Péguy. But I'm thinking of Péguy's mystical disaster, and the idea that to be an atheist would be something of a moral and intellectual achievement in this context, right? Because that would involve like these people aren't even atheists.
Yeah.
And the reason we're not atheists is because, and I think John Paul II and Benedict XVI's diagnosis of the malaise of modernity remains the correct one and the urgent one. And this is the eclipse of the sense of God, the disappearance of God from the human horizon, his utter adventitiousness to our most basic perception of absolutely everything. I mean, we think and breathe and live as if God didn't exist. And as if we couldn't conceive what difference his existence might make. And then we call him in from the outside, right, to baptize our projects. So you get a kind of, if 19th century neo-Thomism gave us a kind of extrinsicism from above, you get a kind of extrinsicism from below in the horizontal Christianity of synodality, where you sort of awkwardly call the Spirit in to baptize an apprehension of things from which God is originally absent.
Right.
I think every era of faith gets the atheism that it deserves, and the mediocrity and tepidness of our own faith and the kind of de facto atheism at the heart of so many in the church has led to rather boring atheists in our own age. I mean, would that we could have a thundering Nietzsche again, wohin ist Gott? Ich will es like sagen, Gott ist tot und bleibt tot und wir sind seine Mörder, all right, would that we could have I have to say it in German. It sounds so much more sinister in German, right?
Actually, I'm scared.
Yeah, no, instead we get Bill Maher or Richard Dawkins, or these.
Yeah, or we get the vast numbers of people who don't even think being an atheist or having a position on this is worth the bother.
Well, that's my point. I call it the nullification of God, the nullification of the question. It's not even, that's my point here. It's the atheism, so-called, of a Richard Dawkins really isn't atheism. It's not intellectual enough to be atheist.
Right.
And that was kind of your point, that it would require a certain achievement actually for them to actually become real atheists. But whatever that is, it's not atheism. It's more the nullification of the very question.
But my point is really that this is by and large the position of many of us who think we believe as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That line from Péguy that Christians are those who don't what is it? Who don't believe what they believe, or something to that to that effect. I mean, but
I think it was.
Go ahead.
It was Péguy who said that modern Christianity is characterized by the believers who don't believe any longer.
So there you go. That's the line I'm looking for, some translation thereof. But the point being that then this is infused. This isn't something external to the church. This is something I think all of us. I mean, and this is also not something that I'm pointing fingers at this or that particular bad guy. I mean, I think all of us carve what faith we can muster out of this sort of inertial backdrop. Mm-hmm. And because this is what defines the modern world. And I think when John Paul II and Benedict XVI talked about the eclipse of the sense of God and man, that's kind of what they were getting at. And and the shadow is not just outside of us. And what I liked about Tracy's talk is, in calling us to to that that exalted vision, right? In allowing us to sort of glimpse the grandeur of Christian faith and the dramatic character of the battle that we're in. It kind of allows us to see, by contrast, how tepid our own belief tends to be. I mean, it's quite a backdrop against which to measure sort of present mediocrity.
Yeah, to go back to something you said a while ago, Michael, do I really live my life as if the Christ event is the most important event in the history of the world, in the history of the cosmos? Do I really live my life like that? And the answer would be no, not really. So it makes me wonder. I often say to people when I give talks here and there, I'm not being judgmental when I'm talking about these things in our culture. I'm a leper preaching to other lepers. I'm infected with the same bacillus of modernity as everybody else is. That's why I can speak on it. That's why you can speak on it. And it's the very nature of modern belief that it is tainted from within by unbelief. And I think it's of a I think it's a different quality than the sort of unbelief that maybe tainted faith in the past. There's a deep-seated plausibility structure in the sociology of our times that makes it impossible, really, truly, almost impossible for there to be faith in a kind of naive, first naivete, pristine kind of way. It's got to be a kind of second naivete. I don't know who coined that phrase, but somebody did. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead, Rodney.
No, I mean, yeah, all of this is right. It's so right, and it's kind of obviously what Nietzsche was talking about in terms of the death of God. It's he realized that if you take God out of the equation, and just about 99.999% of the things that people are worried about and talking about and doing, it makes no difference whatsoever. Right. In other words, there's this great part of I've been reading a lot of Chesterton, so I apologize, but I've been reading the autobiography, and he gets to this part where he's talking about his friends on Fleet Street when he was a journalist right before his conversion, and they were kind of nominally Anglican, and they began going to this church that was kind of run by a progressive Anglican, liberal, free-thinking Anglican priest. And then he left, and then another guy came in, and they wanted it to be kept called the same thing, but he was so now far gone that he didn't want God or church or anything to be mentioned. So they called it like I can't remember the name of it, but it was something like the Education Society. They would go there on Sunday mornings, and they would do this thing because the priest that they had now couldn't entertain anything. And then after he left, they got a guy that was kind of an Anglo-Catholic who really believed in the Trinity and stuff. And he said what struck him, because he was not yet, a believer or whatever, is that it made no difference to them. Like the bits they cared about were the same, regardless whether the priest believes in God or not. And it was they were still about their social justice and all the things they really were passionate about. And he doesn't believe in God. What's that have to do with Christianity?
It's like a great episode of Yes, Prime Minister, actually, where he has to choose an Anglican bishop. Floating around out there in the YouTube sphere somewhere. It's absolutely hilarious.
Right, it is true. And I often, like Kelly and I, sometimes we come from mass, and I'll say something like, let's take the homily, and I'll say, what difference does the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ make to what was said today? And I hate to say it, but like 90% of the time, the answer is bupkis. Like if Jesus did not die and rise from the dead, nothing in that homily would have had to change. It would have worked either, it's because it's so much of it is just a kind of dreary moralism, whether right or left. In our parishes, it tends to be right, it tends to be more traditional moralism, but it's still a kind of dreary lifeless moralism that really requires no vertical at all. And it's no wonder then that, how many Catholics don't believe that Christ is present in the Eucharist? Kind of, who cares? That's a,
and this is something that's been percolating in the church for we tend to focus on the post-conciliar era because it's the era that we all grew up in.
Yeah.
But the fact is, I mean, you can read Bernanos, Diary of a Country Priest, 1936. The curé of Abricourt begins by saying, "My parish is bored like all the rest." There's not a damn thing we can do about it in so many words. That's the haunting part. Not that the curé says, "My parish is bored like all the rest," but that he concludes by saying, "We see it, and yet there's nothing that we can do about it." That is a haunting insight from Bernanos, I think. I mean, and you can even go back before Bernanos to others, to Newman. Newman is already in the 1830s, while still an Anglican, presciently foreshadowing the fact that there's some deep unbelief that is percolating in the church. Cyril O'Regan has this great quote in one of his Church Life Journal articles, where in essence what he says that Newman is claiming is that modernity represents a shift in consciousness, not just a different set of values, but a different way of thinking. Our consciousness has changed, or what the French call a mentalité, or what Peggy might call a mystique. This has changed radically at its foundation. And my problem with the modern church, with the Massimo Fagiolis of the church, is that they don't have the faintest understanding that this is true.
Yeah.
That's my chief. Not that they're too liberal or too conservative. I know traditionalists, all right, I might agree with on this or the other, who don't understand this either.
Yeah. Totally agree that this afflicts both of the camps that the church presently seems to be resolving itself into. Which is why, when I think about, as everyone is now, because this pontificate will not last forever, what one would hope for from the next pope. I mean, there's a lot of things I suppose one could hope for from the next pope. It's an interesting question to stop and think on it. But one would hope that it would be that the next pope would have a deep understanding of this. Yeah. Right. I mean, how one, quote unquote, interprets the signs of the times is actually really quite important. And I don't think we've done a particularly good job of that. I don't think we did it, at the turn of the 19th century. I mean, there was a depth and I mean, in the figures of the Nouvelle Theologie. I mean, they understood the pathologies of modernity, I think, at quite a deep level. Better, I think, than the Neo-Thomists did. And presumably, and you see hints of this actually. I mean, the conciliar documents like Gaudium et Spes are interesting because they're so mixed. I mean, there are cross currents of optimism and real depth of insight into the precariousness of the modern age. And it's not clear to me that the council ever resolved itself to one mind about that. Maybe it's leaving the question open to be decided by history or what have you, but history has moved on. We can see that some of the prophets of doom had a point. This is the thing about times; they change. That's why they're called times. And even if we're talking about, we both regard ourselves as sort of Vatican II Catholics, whatever that means. And we both have accounts of what that means, or all three of us. I mean, we all regard ourselves that way, but if part of what that means is paying attention to the meaning of one's moment in history, it is no longer 1965.
Right.
There is the process of unbelieving has advanced. and seeped in. And there are all various kinds of manifestations of that now that weren't that one couldn't anticipate then. And what I would hope for is someone who appreciates that in some depth, someone who grasps the nature of the disaster and the mystique that Big E talks about along the depths that you're suggesting is required.
Exactly. Several things. First, and I'll turn it over to you, Rodney. You mentioned that these guys get it right, like the Blundells, the Piggies, the Newmans. They got it right in a way the Neo-Thomists didn't. And it's not that the Neo-Thomists were wrong. It seemed, for the most part, the Neo-Thomists looked at modernity as a series of errors to be corrected.
Right.
Be a proper argumentation and dogmatic deduction and proper philosophy. And they weren't wrong. They did a good job, in their own way, of refuting the errors of modernity. What they didn't get, though, they didn't grasp the nettle of the error, its deep-seated rootedness in the malaise of the soul that the church herself had helped to create in some ways. Quite and then did you go to the Second Vatican Council? Yeah, I mean, I love the dogmatic constitutions, Lumen Gentium, Dei Verbum, things like that. Rodney, you're talking about this, but some of it's more pastoral provisions. We need to remember something. When the council opened in 1962, it was 17 years after the end of World War II. That is less time than it has been since 9/11. It has now been 23 years since 9/11, and just think of how fresh that event still is in our minds and how it has still affected us. The Second Vatican Council, 17 years after the end of World War II, and these were bishops, many of whom lived under Nazi occupation and had suffered the ravages of war. So liberal democracy, here's my point, from Maritain and others, all right, liberal democracy didn't seem like something you really wanted to poke too much at it.
Sure.
You didn't want to scrape at that scab too much because it seemed like, you know what, this is kind of a breath of fresh air. So let's reach across the aisle, stop the acrimonious, oh, you Protestants this and you Jews that, and let's get on with building a better humanity. But you're right, those are not our times anymore. Okay, not our times, and the crisis that began 200 or 300 years ago is finally sort of, I think, reaching its high point. But anyway, Rodney, did you want to interject?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is related, and the people that we read and have learned a lot from seem to have grasped something, as you said, Larry, or even out, the crisis of our present time, which is obviously, like Michael said, even more unbelief, right? But the question is, how can you have a culture? And this is where Tracy's talk is so helpful, because it does get to the level of culture, how important culture is. It seems to me that it's not the job of Christianity to invent a sense of the divine, and right, or the sense of the kind of sacredness, the sacred aspects of reality and things like that, right? I mean, it never really had to do that. Like the Jews didn't even have to do that. They were already, I mean, Abraham already knows what it means to believe in a God, or or something, right? God doesn't have to come and tell him. He just has to, refine in a fairly radical way his concept of God. The crisis of modernity is that there is no longer a natural sense at all of the divine. And I think this is what Guardini meant when he said the modern person is incapable of a liturgical act. Because a liturgical act is a response to something in reality. It's a spontaneous reaction to something in reality that is considered, amazing, worthy of worship, a harvest, right? Or whatever, right? Where you're like, wow, we've gotten crops again, and it's not just like, oh, same old, the crops came up. It's like, it's amazing that the crops came up, right? Yeah. So now we're going to have a festival, and we're going to give thanks, and we're going to offer, whatever. And so as long as it seems to me that God is removed from those ordinary experiences of life, having a baby, gathering a harvest, whatever they might be, we can't expect people to walk into mass on Sunday, right? And all of a sudden turn off the everything has a natural explanation narrative and now turn on, wow, we're gonna be in touch with some supernatural stuff right now. I think that's a real issue that I think many priests are unaware of. They're worried that people don't believe in the real presence. My bishop is very worried about that, and there's now lectures in the diocese about the real presence. And I'm in favor of all that. But if you can't see mystery in reality, why does it surprise them that we can't see or believe the presence of Christ in the bread and the wine? I mean, so there has to be some attempt again to rediscover the naturalness of religiosity, if I could put it that way. I think that's a huge crisis. I don't know if that's off topic, but
No, it's not off topic. I mean, I think that's brilliant. It's gosh, there's just so many doors that opens. You think of C.S. Lewis's Christianity as myth become fact, but that doesn't negate the realm of mythopoesis. It elevates the realm of mythopoesis, and it's true. What does it feel like? What is the mentalite to live in a culture, say like the Mayans, who sacrificed human beings and ripped out their hearts by the thousands because they were afraid the sun wasn't going to come up the next day, right? And were thrilled when the sun came up the next day. There's a certain sense in which, now that we understand the laws of nature, we've so demystified the cosmos that we're not capable any longer of a liturgical act that takes the spontaneity and gratitude and amazement. I mean, what is it? Chesterton said, that only a child can look at a field of daisies and be amazed at each individual one. And Chesterton says, that God looks at each one and loves each one in its individuality. Somebody says, do it again, do it again, do it again, do it again. And that's like a little kid. Do it again, do it again. No matter how many times you throw them in the air. We've lost that. We're jaded. We're cynical. We've reduced everything in the natural world to natural reasons of law and so forth. I would much rather believe that grass grows because there are wee people in the roots pushing it up than because it's photosynthesis and biochemistry. That's my take on things.
But you can't. That's the problem. You can't.
No, I can't.
You can't will yourself to believe that.
No, I can't. I'm laughing at it now because I know it's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, any addition, I use this example all the time in various settings and with my students. You think about from Plato through Augustine through the entire tradition, the imagery of the sun, right? The sun as a visible image of the intelligible good that, like God, is blinding to look at, but that illuminates everything that it touches. And the likening of reason to light on the analogy with the sun, understanding that the sun is an analogy for the intelligible rays of the divine intellect and all of that. And to think what it would have been to understand that the sun and that the sun in its very being were an image. We're an image of we're a visible image of the invisible God. We can will ourselves to in a certain sense through historical study and through reading the church fathers and reading Plato or whatever to sort of regard it that way. But whatever success we have in doing that is always superimposed on the more fundamental idea that the sun is a big, meaningless ball of gas.
Yeah.
And that's
right.
it.
Yeah.
And the entire universe space. So we live in, what George Grant calls, a monism of meaninglessness.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Where does he say that? Do you remember?
I don't recall exactly, but
okay.
it's a perfect phrase. That applies to our conception of nature and the external world. And we could get into our spiel about the expulsion of form and final causality and intrinsic meaning and all of those various things we lament all the time in the sort of mechanization of nature. But that's ultimately what it amounts to. And of course now, and to my mind, the political liberalism on one hand and the sexual revolution on the other hand are perfect expressions of this. We've turned that on ourselves. Right. So, we are the the biological equivalents of big balls of gas. And you're absolutely right, Rodney. I think that if that is reality as you unreflectively apprehend it, and that forms the backdrop to which then faith has to be added, then there's something that always sort of remains out of reach or impossible about believing and the desire to believe with one's whole heart.
Yeah.
Right. And another great phrase from George Grant that might be at least a partial solution to this is that it's not lost entirely if you can still suffer the pain of that. So he talks about sort of intimations of deprival as being the way that the presence of God or the good registers itself, right? And it's a very traditional way of talking about eros, as a kind of presence that shows itself as absence, and part of the problem, it seems to me, with those, you mentioned Fagioli and others, who simply don't get this problem, is that there's no space for that kind of eros, that kind of longing for for something that seems forever beyond our reach. And there's no place for that to ever enter in that I can see. Right. So you get this completely undramatic, I don't even know quite how to describe it. I feel like when I read some of these guys, when I read him, I feel like I'm trapped in a session of the AAR.
For those who are listening, the American Academy of Religion.
I can't get out. And I mean, it's just soul killing.
It's like an ecclesial Truman Show where you suddenly you realize, oh my God, I'm in a fake world and I'm being filmed and I can't get out. I can't get out.
But it's this sense that this coming to the depths of that this sort of psychic transformation that you talk about, or this profound transformation of our fundamental being in and apprehension of the world. This monism of meaninglessness, it seems to me, captures some of the substance of what that transformation consists in. And this is the thing we have to come to grips with, if we're going to come to grips with our own atheism, right? And really have a hope of passing on, in a fuller form, the faith, the fullness, and in its fullness.
I think. Go ahead, Rodney.
I mean, it's interesting when I read Fagioli. Once you get into his world, he's very clever. I mean, he's thoughtful, and he tries to be kind of balanced in the way he treats both factions in the church and all these different things. But when you back up and look, you realize that it's precisely, Michael, as you were saying. I kind of think of it in terms of the Baltazarian. Baltazar's whole entire theology is a drama between finite and infinite freedom. And I feel like when I'm reading Fagioli, it's a drama between finite and finite freedom. There's no infinite freedom. It's all factions, and if we just angle it this way, that will it's 100% horizontal. If there's any,
it's suffocating to read, actually.
Insofar as he occasionally references theology, right? It's always already in the context of the battles he's already formed between parties, and he's always analyzing the various parties that are working right now in 2024 in the church. What are they doing? How are they strategizing? Oh, it's so
well, just like his article in Commonweal, the recent one that, the Trump Strickland axis and this emerging Trump Catholic alliance, and the word on fire is part of this. I mean, my article in Catholic Road Report on this, but I don't want to rehash all that. But the fact is that the whole article.
Say one thing about it. Thank you for that, because what you said in that article needed to be said.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think it did. That's why I wrote it. I knew that it would be, a bit painful to write because, you're calling out normally when I write, I don't call out a specific person by name, and that's not a pleasant thing to do. I don't know Mr. Fagioli. I'm sure in his private life, he's a perfectly wonderful human being. And I'm not saying that sarcastically. I don't know him. And so it was distasteful to do that. I don't like doing that. But nevertheless, it needed to be done because he was calling out people by name and caricaturing them and so on. But the point is, I'm just underscoring what you guys are saying, which is he and others like him, it's not just him, think in these utterly political categories. And that's what the Commonweal article was. It was trying to reduce all of modern conservative Catholic concerns into this little thing called Trumpism, and then raise a red flag and say, look out, Trump on the horizon. I don't know. It just was so silly.
And axes of power and all that stuff. But I think the thing that is kind of maybe the takeaway here is we could all sit down and read his articles, and lots of people do, and not even realize that something's missing.
Yeah.
That's the point, right? That we've gotten so forgetful of this other perspective that you read it and you're like, oh, he's just kind of like weighing in. He's probably a little bit left leaning, whatever. We kind of get caught up in it and forget, like, wait a second, there's no drama, there's no vertical here at all. And this kind of brings it back full circle to the Roland commencement address. What was so bracing and refreshing is the insistence on the vertical, right? And standing up for that first and foremost before all things. She wasn't trying to I don't know, sort of like put herself in a position so she can gain more power in the church. I mean, that's not what's going on there. She's pulling, all hatches are stopped, she's just going for broke because she believes in what she's saying.
Yeah.
And that's what's going to resonate with those kids there. I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it makes for quite a contrast too. Not only, Fagioli's article, and I read a lot of that stuff, a lot of his journalistic work, at least some of the books too. I even, incidentally, I even watched a talk he gave at, I think it might have been at Mundelein. I'm not sure where it was. On what else? Vatican II and synodality or something. I don't recall exactly.
Fill in the blank.
Together. Yeah, but I will say he's actually, I actually developed a little bit of more of a soft spot. I mean, I really bristle against him in print because I find his project to be, to be honest, if I may say this, somewhat devious. But he's much more charming in person, and so I softened a little bit in the course of watching that. But all of that aside, I mean, it really does make for two contrasting visions, right? Not only visions of the church, but visions of the meaning of our historical moment. I mean, when I say, when I say that reading Fagioli is like being trapped in a session of AAR, and in this particular talk, he reads it all through the lens of the abuse crisis, post-colonialism, and there's a third contemporary historical factor. There would be of particular interest at the AAR, but not in the real world. For the most part, that is defining this, and just and this goes to your point about the utter failure in vast quarters of the church to sort of perceive what time it is, as they say.
Yeah.
And what, on the flip side, what's reassuring about that is that and reassuring about Tracy's talk is that even if the kind of perspective, the kind of political and sociological, and for that matter, historical reduction of the church, because history is only sort of interesting from that point of view in terms of what it means for the present, right? Because the church, the people of God means us. It doesn't mean the whole community, the communio sanctorum or anything. It was when people always talk about, I hate the phrase "our church" that you see in print all the time, because what the meaning of that possessive. But to the extent that point of view has the upper hand within the church and in the hierarchy, and is likely to continue to enjoy the upper hand in some form or fashion, through the next pontificate, which I suspect it probably will. Given the way the Cardinals of the College of Cardinals is composed, and just given that there's no one anymore with a Balthazar or de Lubac's formation. I mean, we don't have giants. We're much smaller than our ancestors in the faith were. So I would expect, the future to be more mediocre. Whatever the case may be, what I found so refreshing about and reassuring about Tracy's talk is however much short-term pain that might mean. And I suspect for us, for guys our age, that will mean short-term pain for the rest of our lives. We're not going to see the resolution of this. But it's not, it won't endure.
Right.
What will endure is what is eternally true and good and beautiful, and what is able to sort of show itself anew in every generation.
Yeah.
And there is such a thing, and that's what we have to hold to, and we have to continue to try and find ways to rediscover and to think about and to help make visible, and to orient ourselves and help others orient themselves toward. And Tracy's talk was great in that respect.
Yeah. I mean, and there are signs of hope here and there. By the way, our mutual friend Bill Portier assures me that Massimo Fagioli is quite the nice gentleman.
I don't doubt it.
Bill likes him very much, and because I was raging against him at some lunch I was having with Portier. He goes, "Oh, cool your jets, cool your jets, chap. He's all right. He's not a bad dude." Bill's always good for bringing me back down to earth. But anyway, but like you, my main I don't know him personally, and I harbor no, but what he writes is so typical of an entire generation of horizontalist, contextualized, politicized thinkers. And they've done great damage to the church. And I'm sorry, what Fagioli represents does great damage to the church. I was struck in Tracy's talk on a personal level, thinking of, damage to the church, the story of the seminarian, right? She tells the story of that seminarian whose parents outed him for being pious. They show he's trying to fly under the radar because the seminary is all liberal and Skillebeck and Kung and these guys, and he likes John Paul and Benedict. So he's flying under the radar, and his parents show up, and they blow his cover. And I remember when I was in seminary, I was flying under that same kind of radar, and my mother had given me this gigantic rosary made out of stones. I mean, it was like this 5-foot big, huge stone rosary that she expected me to hang on my seminary room wall, as evidence of my devotion to the Virgin Mary and whatnot. So I forgot to put it up when she was visiting, because obviously I wasn't going to put it up because to do so would have branded me.
That branded you a Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. I would have been outed as a Catholic in the seminary, and you don't want to be perceived as a Catholic in the seminary in the late 70s and early 80s. That was verboten. But anyway, that's completely off topic in some sense, but it's in another sense it's not, because these little anecdotal stories need to be documented, and they have been documented and written down, because the theology that was employed, and I guess the theology of Fagioli and others now as well, although slightly different, is damaging. It's extremely toxic. It's poisonous, and it needs to be called out.
Well, not only that, if it were simply and merely a matter of academic treatises that were bad and false, that would be damage at a certain level. But there's very much a sort of medium is the message factor to this. I mean, a lot of these guys, and it's one of the reasons why it's hard for me to sort of straighten out, most of us probably are much nicer in reality than we are in print. And, I've had a bit of a sharp pen. I've had a sharp pen from time to time, and I'm sure if some of the objects of my criticism were to meet me and we were to sit down to have a beer together, we would discover more about each other than you do by dueling through keyboards or what have you. But there is a medium, is the message dimension to this, in that Fajoli and others have spent pretty much 10 years sort of waging a campaign of oftentimes quite a vicious campaign, I would argue, of narrative management on Twitter. That doesn't remain confined to Twitter, has real world consequences, with respect to people's lives and careers and various other things, as well as people's perceptions of things. And it's very difficult to sort of sort out the perception you build up of someone over that period of time watching this stream or these streams, because he's by no means the only person doing it. It's a different phenomenon than when theologizing was confined to the writing of works of academic scholarship. But when you're cranking out articles every day, like the one that's serving a function within a larger discernible project, or when you're I don't really follow Fajoli's Twitter anymore. They've changed the terms of which you can look at things, but I used to sort of see what was going on in the world by looking at various things on Twitter, and I noticed that the timestamps on a lot of his tweets were like 4 o'clock in the morning, and I presumed it's because it was for a European a European audience or what have you. This is what, by the way, this is one of the reasons why I decided, as tempting as it has always been, because I think I would be a pretty good, and I could be a pretty good and lethal tweeter had I decided to do that. Slicing people up in 140 characters, it fits my personality. It would be a lot of fun to do. And there have been times when I've thought, if I had a Twitter account, I would really. But the reason that I've always refrained from doing it is because I feel like it's a medium designed to show the world what a jerk you are, and how superficial you are, or what a superficial jerk you are. And I want people to come to realize that about me slowly, and in person, not broadcasted instantaneously, but when you commit yourself to that medium. And there's a curious thing. I mean, I remember getting in an argument one time. This was an entirely different sphere. This was against the integralists, and I made mention in an article. I won't mention any names here since that's not the subject of today, but I mentioned in an article, this thing a guy had tweeted about me, and his response was to mock on Twitter the fact that I had cited a tweet from however many years ago that he barely even remembered making. And I thought, the thing about think about what that means. The thing about this medium is that it allows you to instantaneously communicate with thousands of people, shaping their opinions or giving them permission not to think, and simultaneously disavow the seriousness of your own words, and that you should be held accountable for them by saying, I was only tweeting. There's something inherently sophistic about that. When you commit yourself to a Twitter campaign, or a Twitter commentary about an ongoing Twitter commentary about current events, and the aggregate effect of that is to shape a gestalt, or perhaps even the intent of it is to shape a gestalt. You deserve to be held responsible for that as part of your body of work as well, it seems to me. Perhaps even more so. There are many more people that have read, I'm sure, Massimo Fajoli on Twitter than have read, the book on Vatican II or the book on Joe Biden or what have you. Right, and the same thing would be true of Ivory or anybody else on the other side who tweets all the time. I mean, the idea that that you're not responsible for those words. We've drifted off. It's just simply to say that it's a bit harder to come to that kind of sanguine sort of judgment about what a good bloke somebody really is when they have a constant and sustained Twitter presence, because that does say something about you.
I for years my wife refused to let me have a Twitter account. She because she said it would not be a good medium for me. But
In one way, it would be a great medium for you.
Yeah, well, that's the trouble. But I did finally last year. I got a Twitter account, and I have to admit, I've been very Spartan in my use of it, and for that reason, part of it, the biggest thing, and then this kind of, in some ways, obliquely ties into themes that George Parker's brought up, and George Grant has brought up, and Tracy and others. The main thing about it, other than its viciousness and its superficiality, is it is a monumental time waster. You know,
sure.
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you can get sucked into discussions on there. Like I got into a Facebook conversation with David Mills, who was a big Fajoli supporter in his diatribe against Word on Fire and so on. And David, who I like, was supporting Fajoli, and I wasn't. So I thought, well, David's an important player, so I'm going to get involved in this conversation. So I interjected myself into it. I don't think David liked it very much. But the fact is, I spent like a couple hours of my day doing that, and I just think, is this really a good and solid, use of our time? More than anything.
You know that thing on your phone that tells you how much screen time you've spent every day?
Yeah.
I mean, when we stand before the pearly the pearly gate for the judgment seat, and you're confronted with that.
Yeah. Look, here, that's the thing. But seriously though, to bring it back, and then Rodney maybe come into it. And well, we've been at this about an hour and 15, so we should wrap up soon, I guess. But to me, to bring it back to Fajoli, the Commonweal article, the Twitter conversation that we're having, is this: what is involved here, and this is the sad part, isn't in any way, shape, or form, and this goes to Tracy's talk as well, any kind of decent, deep, and profound theology. Right. As Rodney was saying, Lumen Gentium, the mystery of the church, the verticality of things. There isn't any decent theology in it at all. And therefore, what is it? What is it for? What was the Commonweal article? If Fazoli's a smart enough guy to know, for example, the Word on Fire certainly isn't in the Trump axis or any bullshit like that. So what was it really about? Narrative control. Yeah. This is the weaving of a narrative. This is propaganda. And that's what irritates me. That it's an enemies list, like Mike Lewis at Where Peter Is. He doesn't give a damn really about the papacy. He just likes Pope Francis for some reason. And so he's got this enemies list that he makes up in his mother's basement, and then public, and whatever, and so much of it is like this. Friends of Pope Francis, enemies of Pope Francis. And then boom, let's control this narrative. And so the latest narrative is, well, if you're a conservative Catholic at all on the social issues, you're probably in league with Trump. Give me a break. So that's what this is about. And it's been about this since the end of the council. It's been about narrative control. Who controls the narrative?
It is interesting that the way he frames the whole problem is both a pope that he thinks might get him what he wants, aligned with a president that he likes, that he thinks might get him what I want, versus a pope that he probably wouldn't like, aligned with a president he wouldn't like. It's all totally sociological. The questions of, is it true or good or beautiful? This is power. Who's going to be in power? And the scare this is a constant thing that goes on in American politics, is the one candidate tries to make the other candidate look even scarier than himself, you know what I mean? Or herself. Right? They're all bad. So you just have to make the other guy look even worse,
Yeah, you're talking about the Joe Biden book there. Fajoli's Biden, and I forget the title of it now. I probably have it here somewhere. Maybe one of you guys remembers the title of the book. I know the book that you're talking about. I've always said that that's an absolutely unforgettable book, in that he should never be allowed to forget that he wrote it. Whether it's weathering so badly. And the humorous thing about that book, I recall, is that it was actually released on the day of Biden's inauguration. like January 20th. So either so I've thought about this. How does the book come about so as to be so that its release is timed precisely with this? Either, here's a man who's spent years toiling anonymously in the bowels of libraries to understand the history of American Catholicism and American religious history and politics. And the Lord just delivered an opportune moment into his hand with the election of Joe Biden, or this is something that was sort of dashed off between the end of final exams or between Thanksgiving over Christmas break.
Between November of 2020 and January of 2021.
Yeah. Either that or it's all been cribbed from, you just lifted it off of Twitter and put it in book form. I don't know, but talk about Exhibit A as a sort of remarkable attempt, failed attempt, I think. Obviously, everyone saw through that, who didn't want to not see through it, at narrative control. And there's even a way when you back out of the sort of AAR speak, this whole project of sort of remembering or sort of the contested memory of Vatican II and the problematization of our historical memory, when you sort of remove that sort of jargon, he more or less tells you that his project is about determining how the council is remembered and what it meant for the future, right? It's generativity for the future. And I worried a lot more about this kind of thing 3 or 4 years ago. I feel like it's run its course. Its momentum has petered out. And we'll just, the future is going to come, as C.S. Lewis says, at the rate of 60 seconds per minute, day after day, year after year, one day at a time, regardless of what we do. And I don't think there's anything particularly enduring in that, but precisely for the reasons that you suggested, Larry, because there's just no depth there at all. There's no, you can't found the sociological church will not survive.
It's also dawning on them that the man that they thought was their great champion, the man who was going to usher in finally, after a 35-year interruption, the true Vatican II, Pope Francis. It turns out that Pope Francis has suddenly tacked to the right. Right? He's tacked the sails to the right. So, they're looking at him going like, what did he say in that private meeting? And so on. And there's also this, irrespective of what one thinks of all the LGBTQ issues and where one fits, James Martin or not James Martin, and so on. And this says something about Pope Francis, and I'll just put it bluntly, why I don't like him, why I think he's a lousy Pope. Can you imagine a John Paul or a Benedict sitting in a meeting of bishops and using that word, throwing out a slur like that to a gathered group of bishops and saying to them, there's too much blankety blank in our seminaries? One can say seminaries are a bit campy. Seminaries have a culture of effeminacy. Seminaries need to become more masculine. Say, oh, they're fine. But to use that term, the Italian equivalent of, the pejorative for gays in English, I think betrays a certain lack of character in the man. And in some ways, I think this has demoralized the Fagiolis as well, and the Austin Ivorys as well, as they realize that their champion is actually a bit of a jerk.
Rodney, would you like to speak to that?
I'm not sure how to follow that. I'll just say this, Larry. I think it is interesting that Michael said it about these guys that came before us who were formed in a particular way and just exuded a certain, like a giant, if a Benedict walked into the room, I would want to make sure that I had my act together. You know what I mean? Like I would be like, oh, Benedict, you know what I mean? And this JP2 or Balthazar, any of these giants, right? And And yeah, where are you going to get that again? I mean, it's even if even again, if they pick a guy who's more traditional theologically, we're all infected by the bacillus of this culture that is just so everybody's kind of in the gutter, including myself, so it doesn't. It's kind of interesting that if the knock against Pope Benedict and JP2 is they were so in theory and so in the realm of ideas that they didn't touch the common person. What that actually does, though, is that it gives them an equilibrium where they're not constantly shooting from the hip and reacting, emotionally and slurs and all this stuff. And that's something I miss, frankly, is that kind of class or whatever you want to call it in the office.
Well, I think we can say that these were giants and these were intellectual giants and so forth. That's all well and good. My problem is this: these John Paul and Benedict were men of virtue.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the current pontiff lacks certain essential virtues to being a proper pontiff. That's my only point. I don't want to smear you guys with, guilt by association with me, but that is my deep and heartfelt feeling about one of the reasons why I think I'm just responding to Michael's point that this movement, I used to worry more about this movement before Pope Francis sort of put the brakes on it. No to women deacons, no to women priests, no, we're not going to have gay marriage in the church and so on. Okay. Yeah. So he's sort of tacked to the right a little bit. But I also think that it's losing its steam because there's a certain awareness that the Pope is not to be trusted by his allies here. Anyway, Michael.
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm going to lay off of all of that, but the other thing is, two things. One of the reasons I think, that it's not just that it's losing its steam. It causes me to lose my steam. I mean, in the sense that it's exhausting. I'm exhausted with it. I don't know about you. I admire the fact that you sort of kicked this whole thing up here in these these late days to sort of fight the good fight. I mean, the temptation. I mean, one of the consequences of the overwhelming, one of the possible consequences that one has to really fight against and resist, that I find I have to fight against in myself, in the face of the sort of overwhelming, sort of suffocating mediocrity and decay of all this, is the temptation not to care. Right, the sort of temptation to sort of give up the fight because it just, that's something that one has to resist. And frankly, if I can extrapolate from my own experience, I think one of the reasons that it might be that some of this might be losing its steam is because people are exhausted with it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's so true.
The whole controversy just before Christmas about fiducia, for example. I mean, good Lord. I mean, it's just, give me a cup of eggnog and some Bing Crosby and forget about this. It's just, it's a bit too much. So that's the one thing I wanted to say. The other is almost the mere opposite of that. And it goes to the question of giants. I don't hold out intellectual, spiritual, virtuous for that matter. I don't hold out great hope for that. But we desperately need it. Yeah. And the reason that we need it, and by that I'm simply reiterating what you said earlier about the need to understand deeply what we're going through, because you brought up the LGBTQ issue, and I'm far less concerned about the fact about, and perhaps I shouldn't be because people's souls are at stake and all that, but I'm far less concerned in a certain sense by the so-called loosening of sexual morality than I am by the fact that this movement and the ideology of this movement and its accompanying scientific and biotechnical apparatus has put the entire order of nature and creation into up for grabs.
Yep.
And it seems to me that the consequences of that are they're not just theoretical. We're seeing that. You see this in the the science experiment that we're performing on a generation of adolescents. I mean, it's the implications of what we are doing are astronomical, and the shallowness with which we are confronting that is frightening, because no one outside the church is really confronting it in any depth at all. I mean, it kind of falls to the church as the quote unquote expert in humanity to dive deeply into this and to understand what this means.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And we're not doing it, or we're doing it in an isolated way, but not. And there's that remarkable, I probably mentioned this to you before. I've quoted it a couple of times in print, and maybe I've called it your attention to it, but there's this remarkable quote, or this remarkable speech from Benedict XVI just before he abdicated, like at Christmas of 2012, where he just sort of lays out what he didn't use the language of transgender, but what the transgender revolution really is a kind of rebellion against being and nature and our own nature. It's astonishing
what we're doing to children, and this, in many ways, the silence of the church in many ways. In the some people have spoken it and so forth, but it just seems from the top what we're getting is concerns over climate change while we're surgically mutilating our children. And you say, oh, climate change is important. I would, fine, climate change is real. Burn up the planet rather than cut out the ovaries of a single 8-year-old girl. That, what's that? Hey, Rodney, you would know this. What's that thing from Chesterton about the redheaded girl?
Yeah. That's,
so
gorgeous. Yeah.
The very end of What's Wrong with the World?
What's Wrong with the World?
Yeah. It brings you to tears to read it. It's extraordinary.
That he would basically.
And he's so exactly right. He's
that he would rearrange the entire cosmos just to make sure that
not one hair in her head
would be harmed. Be harmed.
Yeah.
And Christ had something to say about this too. It involved millstones and whatnot. But here we are ranting and raving. Anyway, we've been at this about an hour and a half. Gentlemen, any last words before we sign off? We didn't know what we were going to talk about. I thought it was a great conversation, actually.
I enjoyed it. You guys are always a blast. I mean, that turns out, that was safe enough. I probably could have had some gin.
I mean, I got a little dicey at the end, trashing the Pope and whatnot, but you guys were far more sane than I was. But
yeah, well, that was you, not me. Just making that clear.
Let's make that very clear that the man who teaches at the Pontifical Institute is not an. Hear that? All right, very good. Rodney, any last words?
No, I'm good. That was a lot of fun.
All right, very good. Well, this was a fun conversation. Tracy Roland, I hope you were listening to at least the first half of it, which was about you. But then we got off on other things.
You would have liked the rest of it too.
I think she would have loved the rest of it. All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and thanks to my guests. Bye now.